This is Tucker Carlson in Washington. Former First Lady Barbara Bush has died today at the age of 92. It was recently announced she had decided to forego further treatment for her health. Mrs. Bush was one of only 2 women in American history to find herself both the wife of a president and the mother of another president. There was, of course, much triumph in her life. There was also tragedy. She had 6 children, including a daughter, Robin, who died of leukemia at the age of 3 more than 60 years ago. For the rest of her life, that memory made her cry. Other than that, though, Barbara Bush was not one for weeping in public. She was a lifelong advocate for good taste and self-restraint. Fox senior political analyst Brit Hume knew her well for many years, 38 years, and he joins us tonight. Brit, what did you make of Barbara Bush?
She was a woman of enormous character. She adored her husband, and I always had the sense in seeing them together that she never could quite get enough of him, that he was such a gregarious man, he had so many friends, and people liked him, and he liked people, and that there was never quite enough of him to go around as far as she was concerned. And of course she was, as was mentioned in Bill Clinton's statement we just saw on the air a few minutes ago, she was a fierce person. And this was not a mellow first lady. This was a woman of strong views, and yet she managed, Tucker, for all that, not to really ever be a controversial first lady. She just wasn't. And I think it was because people saw her character and admired her, and she was indeed admirable.
Boy, looking at the tape of her on the screen, you really note how much America has changed and how she was really representative of a country that and values that aren't as common as they once were, maybe that have almost disappeared. She was, as you said, famous without being controversial. How did she pull that off?
Well, I think it was obvious, I think, to people who saw her, heard her speak, saw her in action, and watched the way she behaved, that she behaved with a certain dignity and grace befitting the wife of a prominent figure, then a wife, obviously, of a president, later as the mother of a president. So she had that quality that which I think people respected, and she also had about her an obvious goodwill.
Yes.
And I think that shone through in a way that was unmistakable, so that people saw those things in her, and she really never struck a false note. I mean, there was a moment when during the 1988 campaign when Geraldine Ferraro had, excuse me, I guess it was during the 1984 campaign,
yes,
when her husband had debated Geraldine Ferraro during the Reagan re-election campaign against Walter Mondale. And she said that Geraldine Ferraro came across as somebody who could be described as rhyming with rich. And that was immediately taken to mean bitch, but she later clarified that she meant only witch. But if people thought that was improper, they quickly forgave her for that, and she went on to become exceedingly popular and well-liked. I'll say this. You never had the feeling about her that if you had your shirt untucked or you're a little out of order, that she wasn't going to notice. And I remember being at a state dinner. You know, the custom is always, if you're a member of the White House press corps, that there's a certain number of tickets that the press office can give out, and I got to go to one at one time. And my dinner partner was the retired tennis pro then, Chris Evert, who was a friend of the Bush family. And she had on this very short gold evening dress. And the word reached me pretty quickly that Mrs. Bush was not amused by that dress. Me, I thought it was wonderful.
Well, if you talk, I mean, her son, the president, would go on at some length about what a ferocious figure she was, and she must have been. You knew her, of course, in Washington, covering the family. You knew the family in Florida and also in Maine. I mean, you spent a lot of time around a bunch of different parts of the Bush family. She was at the center of it, kind of a remarkable family. What was her role in the family?
Well, she was the. I mean, obviously, she's the matriarch, right? Because she's the mother, the grandmother, the wife of the president, and she was strong, not mellow in the way that her husband was. And so, if those boys and their sister growing up, stepped out of line, it was pretty clear who they were more afraid of. She was starchy, dignified, old line, New England, aristocratic, all those things, and people loved her. And you could say in this political atmosphere where everybody's supposed to be so egalitarian that they loved her in spite of that, but I rather happen to think they loved her because of it.
That's exactly right. You wonder if there's space for someone like that in modern American life.
Well, I think so. If you behave with grace and dignity and decorum and obvious goodwill, and you know, that people are going to respect that. And she, you know, she had that, and she also had that countenance, you know, with the white hair, which she had from quite a young age. That's why I guess it was her husband who dubbed her the Silver Fox, and so she was known to many people by that sobriquet. And she kind of lived that part, you know. She was quite a figure, and she's a real loss to the country. And I can only think about how her husband must be feeling tonight, because they were so close, Tucker. I mean, I didn't see a lot of them in recent years, but when I did, when they were together, there was one thing that was always going on. They were holding hands. Yes. And she was, you know, she had portable oxygen the last several times I saw her, and she was getting around as best she could. And of course, he's quite ill, and is believed by the family to be in the, you know, the latter stages of his life. I don't know that it was anticipated by many people outside the family that she would predecease him, as has now happened. But I can only imagine the sense of loss he must feel tonight. And I think, you know, to all of us, our hearts go out to him and to the rest of the Bush family tonight. A great lady has died.
We're looking at pictures outside the Bush family home in Texas. We just saw a video a minute ago of Barbara Bush with her then famous Springer Spaniel, Millie, a reminder that she was a great lover of Springer Spaniels, one of the best things about her, or anyone, I would say. But she must have also, as you pointed out, she was with her husband all the time. She traveled with him. She was the head not just of a family, but of a very political family. What was her political sensibility? I mean, she must have had a sense of it, being around it her whole life.
Oh, I don't think there's much doubt about that. And of course, she had a pet issue, literacy, which she had a number of issues and causes that she supported. Literacy was the one that was the most conspicuous. And in fact, I went over to help to be the MC at the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor a year ago last December, and that was at the Bush Library. The Bush 41 Library in College Station, Texas. And the first night we were there, she was not there because she was away at a literacy event with her son Neil. So that was a cause that she never lost sight of, and was a part of her role. By the time, by the way, that I saw her there, the Springer Spaniels were out of the picture, and she had a couple of these little dogs that went with her everywhere she'd go. And you could always tell, apparently, when she was going to come into a room, because she would be preceded by the dogs. And they kept an eye on things. She liked that.
Our dogs get smaller as we age. I've noticed that. I'm not looking forward to it. Britt, that was a wonderful summation of an amazing life, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.
John Sununu was, of course, George H.W. Bush's chief of staff and a central figure in that administration and that time, really, in American life. And he joins us tonight with his memories. Governor, thanks a lot for coming on. What are your memories of Barbara Bush?
Well, she was a great lady and a great friend, and it's obviously a great loss. It's amazing how she was really the rock of that family, and they all acknowledge it. She held all the pieces together. And when I was in the White House, I was fortunate enough to end up with a great relationship with her. We had developed a good relationship in the '88 campaign, and you know, she could see through people. She could sense the real people from the phonies, and I think she sensed that I really had the president's back, and so we got along really, really well, and it made my life easy, obviously. But she was there for the president.
So it was important. It was important to get along with her then.
Boy, it certainly was, and the family knew that more than anyone else.
Interesting. Her son, the president, the 43rd president, used to talk about her a lot with a mixture of what sounded like love, awe, and maybe a little bit of fear. Warranted?
I think he called her the enforcer.
Yeah, exactly.
But she really was an exceptional person. She didn't try to be seen all around the White House, but you knew that whenever the president had a tough decision, the person that got his ear last and made the biggest impact was Barbara Bush, and she made a big, big difference that way.
So I want to put up on the screen a statement we just received from the president of 43, George W. Bush. It says this: "My dear mother has passed at age 92. Laura, Barbara, Jenna, and I are sad, but our souls are settled because we know hers was. Barbara Bush was a fabulous First Lady and a woman unlike any other who brought levity, love, and literacy to us. She was so much more. Mom kept us on our toes and kept us laughing until the end. I'm a lucky man that Barbara Bush was my mother. Our family will miss her dearly, and we thank you all for your prayers and good wishes. So I asked Britt this question. You were right at the center of it. How did Barbara Bush manage to be as famous as she was? And she really was pretty famous for a first lady, more than most, I think, and yet pretty widely liked on a bipartisan level. She never was controversial or divisive in the way others have been. How'd she do that?
Well, the way you put your finger on it, she tried to make sure she wasn't controversial or divisive. She was clear in her opinions. People knew where she stood. She didn't straddle on anything, and I think people appreciated the fact that what you saw was what she was, and it really was like that from day one all the way through. I was lucky enough to have a quiet dinner with the President and Mrs. Bush last month. Andy Card and I went down and did an event at the Bush Library, and the President and Mrs. Bush asked us up into the apartment they have there, and she looked a little extra frail there, but you know, even in the condition that we now know she was in, it was a fun dinner. We had talked about old times, we reminisced, we laughed a little bit, and we talked about what was going on. She never let her personal situation impact the quality of the interaction she had with people.
I mean, she just lived through really the whole span of modern American history, 92 years. She was born before the Great Depression in a world that no longer exists, and then she passes in the middle of a world that is becoming something completely different. I wonder how she responded to that. What does she make of it?
Tucker, she not only lived through it, she helped shape it.
That's right.
And I think she was very aware of what a crucial time that she and the President spent in the White House. That was really a hinge point. Post-World War II, the catalyst had been set for the collapse of the Soviet Union with Ronald Reagan's buildup of U.S. defense, but George H.W. Bush was the one that had really the very delicate diplomatic skills to pull it off as smoothly as it was pulled off, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany, and she was a very active part of that whole process. Her relationship with Mrs. Gorbachev was important. Her relationship with the first ladies of the other superpower, of the other major nations around the world, was part of catalyzing the very personal relationship that George Bush developed, and it was his personal relationship to a great extent that allowed that process to work so smoothly. And she was a very important part of that.
Governor John Sununu, the head of another famous political family in this country. Thank you very much, Governor. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker. Take care.
Our friend Brad Blakeman worked as a staffer in the George W. Bush White House. He knew Barbara Bush for decades, and he joins us now, I think, by phone. Brad, are you there?
Sure. Thank you, Tucker.
What are your memories of Barbara Bush?
Well, you know, Barbara Bush was the same behind the camera as she was in front of the camera, always interested in others, always caring for others. The consummate second and first lady of the United States. Family counted more than anything, both her own family and her political family, and the family of America. She made her mark most notably on literacy, both here in America and across the globe, and believing that every worth of every person can be found in their ability to learn and to read. And I was just struck by the fact of how caring she was and how devoted she was, not only to her husband and her family, but the nation. She was a consummate First Lady.
Yeah, and unlike the First Lady she replaced, there really was no mixed response to her. I mean, there was no large group of people against Barbara Bush that I noticed. Were you afraid of her?
You know, you had to be a little bit afraid of her because Mrs. Bush was like your mom.
Yeah.
She would scold you when you were doing something bad, and she would praise you when you were doing something good. I have a quick story. I was a young, advanced person, and I was running around the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and I was to meet the President and the First Lady in the elevator to go to the UN, and I had forgotten my raincoat. It was raining cats and dogs in New York, and I was the only one in the elevator without a raincoat. She looked at me and said, "Brad, where's your raincoat?" I said, "Miss Bush, I was running around. I didn't have time to get it." She says, "Well, that's not a real smart thing to do. Now, you need to go back to your room and get it, and the President and I are going to wait in the car." And 40 cars idling while Brad Blakeman went up to get his raincoat because Mrs. Bush said I was dumb. And I got it, and then she reminded me how smart I was when I had it on.
That's a mother of 6 right there. Brad
That's
Blakeman,
it, right there.
thank you for that.
Pleasure.
Our friend Dana Perino was, of course, the press secretary in the George W. Bush administration, knew Mrs. Bush very well, and joins us tonight by phone. Dana, thank you very much for coming on. How would you sum up the life of Barbara Bush?
Well, it was one of great consequence, and she lived a long life, 92 years, most of it in pretty good health, just loved by her family and by the rest of the world, really. If you listen to the ambassador from the UK who was on with Martha when the news broke that Barbara Bush had passed, and she was beloved around the world as the Bushes had made quite a mark on history. But, Tucker, I wanted to share something. I think that you as a father might have even recognized in her, but if I could reiterate it, one of the things that she and George H.W. Bush did in raising their children is they were determined to make sure that everyone knew that they were loved unconditionally. And George W. Bush, as president, after he left the presidency and wrote his memoir, Decision Point, he really took a lot of time in that book to explain how important that was to his future, because you knew then that you could take risks and you could try something new. You could follow your passions, do whatever you wanted to do, because if it didn't work out, your family was going to be there. And I thought that was such an interesting parenting lesson for me to understand and try to pass on, because if you look at what they were able to do in raising this amazing family that is dedicated to public service and also has kept some humility and humor about them, I really do think that her influence was what drove all of that for them.
I believe it. I remember one of her sons told me that the pivotal experience of her life, and of course it makes sense, was losing her daughter Robin at the age of 3 to leukemia, and that it was the one thing that still made her cry when she thought about it. But other than that, she had this kind of remarkable self-control, not in a bad way, but as a kind of matter of cultural course. She felt it was her duty to keep herself under control in public. I wonder if we'll ever see that again. Will we ever have another First Lady like that? No, I'm serious. I mean, it was a specific kind of American style, and now it's gone. It's interesting.
Yeah, there is a lot to be said about dignity, grace, and again, humility and a sense of humor. I remember when I spoke on behalf of President Bush, if I ever had something snarky that I wanted to say, something really sarcastic that would have been a great zinger and a really good line to quote, but if I thought that she might be watching, I would swallow my words, because it wasn't worth her not being proud of us.
Yeah.
And it was really special to know her. And she touched a lot of lives, so I'm not saying I'm any more special than anyone else. I'm not. But she and I bonded over the fact that she knew I was going to be loyal to her son as the press secretary. And she was also a lot of fun. I do remember one time my husband and I got to meet them in Maine, it was in Houston, and we were talking about the importance of thank you notes, also sort of an old-fashioned thing, but a tradition that I think should continue. I'm sure you do too, Tucker. And
I do.
Peter came back and he wrote a thank you note. Well, I had been traveling and I got back and he didn't have the address. So it finally got there, but it was about 2.5 weeks after our first meeting. We saw her not long after that, and the first thing she said to Peter was, well, that was the longest time I've ever had to wait for a thank you note. And now she said it with a twinkle in her eye, but it was one of those things that you just did not want to disappoint Barbara Bush.
Oh, I had that experience. I was in a public place with her once in a gym, and I ran into my own wife and kissed her a little bit too enthusiastically in the gym, and Barbara Bush gave me this look like, none of that in public, which I sort of appreciated. Anyway, Dana Perino, thank you very much.
You're so welcome. Thanks, Tucker, for all this coverage. Bye.
Thank you. Bill Bennett, of course, served as the Secretary of Education from 1985 to 1988, probably the most consequential and famous Secretary of Education we ever had. That was under President Ronald Reagan. He also held the post of Director of the Office of National Drug Control, the drug czar, under George H.W. Bush, and he joins us by phone. Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming on.
You betcha, Tucker. I got some different stuff for you. Bearing. She had bearing and grace and dignity, and we used to say class. Can't say that anymore. I think Melania, by the way, has a lot of bearing and grace and dignity. You asked about the future. I think she's showing a lot. But my dealings with Barbara Bush were a little different. We used to fight a lot, argue a lot. She was very feisty and very funny. Before I tell you the story, you'll love this. She stood on stage in a downtown Washington hotel giving awards out to 400 inner city girls in my wife's best friends program, 3.5 hours on her feet. Never said a word, never objected. That's the kind of lady she was, and wrote about that program in her book. But she and I clashed. We talked about her interest in literacy and adult literacy. She and I took a trip to Kentucky together, a place where a lot of adult literacy programs were going on. On the way back, she said to me, "You were very polite, but you don't fully approve of this, do you?" You know, the way she spoke in that kind of arch way. Wonderful. And I said, "No, I fully approve of adult literacy. I think we should get it right the first time. You know, that's what schools are for. You understand the job I used to have." So we kidded about that. Another time, if I may, the president had a big conference in Charlottesville. You may remember this, though you were a child, I think, on education. He had all the governors. Bill Clinton was chairman of the national governors. President Bush was the president. Big thing, big falderall, celebrate, common themes, common unity. I was interviewed after the meeting by CBS, and I kind of trashed it. I said, well, we had a lot of Republican pap, we had a lot of Democrat pap, we had a lot of stuff that rhymes with pap. I got word from the White House that the president was not pleased. The next morning, I had a meeting at the White House with the president and the president of Colombia, Barco, on drug policy. As I rounded the turn in the White House to see the president, the First Lady was there, and before I could say hello, she punched me in the stomach and said, why did you have to rain on that parade? What is wrong with you? I mean, that's the kind of girl we're talking about.
I love that. Well,
don't you love that?
Not so easy to keep a household of kids under control. You kind of have to be that way. Her mothering style, parenting style, the style of how she ran the matriarchy of her house was obvious in all of her children, it seemed to me.
You know, my wife took our youngest son, Joe, to the Easter egg roll. I was 2 years old or something. He had all these sweets, all this sugar. And Mrs. Bennett Lane held him up for Barbara to see and approve of him, bless him, and put her hand on his head. And just as she did, he threw up. He just tossed his cookies totally. You're father of many children. This happens. Elaine pulled the baby back so as not to get stuff on Mrs. Bush. And she said, "Oh, dear, yes, that's never happened. I've never, ever seen it in my life." You know, she was just so cool.
That's
she was very cool.
Bill Bennett. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Tucker. Thanks for letting me be part of this. Bye.